I absolutely love mixed media and I'm constantly combining and playing with them. So in today's video I'm going to be sharing my top 5 mixed media combinations with you. So hello, if you're new here, my name is Katie, I'm a full-time sketchbook artist and I know that mixed media can sometimes be a bit overwhelming. So I'm going to be sharing my go-tos, the way that I mix them, because I'm constantly experimenting and playing, but I definitely have my favourites. If you'd like to know all of the shades and colours that I recommend, so my ultimate supply list, you'll want to tune into next week's video where I'll be sharing my 2025 favourites and all the colours that I recommend. But that's going to be a bumper video. It's taken me a long time to edit because I have so much to share. So I thought I'd share this week my favourite combinations. Hopefully this will give you some ideas and inspiration, and you might have some of these supplies already, or it will inspire you to just try things out. So before I share some of those combinations, I first want to talk a little bit about how I work. So as a mixed media artist, I do tend to choose my supplies based on vibes and sort of the energy that I want with my work. If I want to work loose, then I'll use mediums like ink or Inktense blocks and change my tools to, say, a bigger brush so I can get looser strokes. If I want to be a bit tighter, I might use smaller brushes and gouache, or I'll use watercolour paired with line work, which would be inked with fountain pen, with more of a focus on detail. So I come to my sketchbook to play, and choosing supplies and combinations are a huge part of that. I do have a formula in terms of order, though that can definitely change, and I do go back steps depending on my mood and the painting, so it's not like I've moved on and I can't go backwards. It's not super set in stone. I have shared a video about my formula here on my channel already, so I'll leave a link to that up in the cards and down below, where I talk more about this formula and how I work. But the general gist is that I will use my wet mediums first, so paints and ink, and then I'll use dry mediums on top, like my pencils and my pastels. I do also work from big to small, so I start with the larger shapes with the wetter mediums, and then I'll define them down and go smaller, and I'll end with details and final pops of colour. That is a very basic overview of the video that I mentioned, which, like I said, I will leave linked. So now you know a little bit more about my process, let's dive in and I'll share my 5 favourite mixed media combinations. Okay, so first up is gouache. So this is traditional gouache. I really love this as my base. It does get reactivated, so I tend to use this as my layer and then work on top with dry mediums. I'm also going to include watercolour in here, so I do have my watercolour palette. So basically it's a paint layer paired with coloured pencil and Neocolors. So I am showing this as my first one because this is the one that I do the most. So as I said, I do use wet mediums. Generally my go-tos and my comfort zone is traditional gouache and watercolour. Then I will go on top with coloured pencils. So I do really love my Luminance pencils, so I have those in a pot here. I also really like Derwent Inktense pencils and Holbein pencils. Any kind of pencil works, followed by my Neocolors. So I'm going to put some examples as we go on screen, but this is definitely my most used. So a wet water-soluble medium like traditional gouache and watercolour first, and then coloured pencils on top. So I use these, as I mentioned with my formula, of defining smaller shapes. I don't tend to use line work often, and I don't usually outline things with pencils. I usually use that to enhance the texture. So I'll use that for blades of grass, for example, or I'll colour in rooftops of houses. I'll use these as smaller blocks of colour or details rather than outlining. And for me that works really, really well. I love using it in this way, and I do find that the Luminance and Derwent drawing pencils go on top really nicely. The traditional gouache dries really matte, so there's no issues at all there with these mediums going on top. And yeah, I just really like the effect. I did start with gouache, that was my first foray into mixed media, adding the pencils on top, so it will always have a special place in my heart, and I do think it's really versatile. So I'll put down my paint first, then I'll work in with my coloured pencils, and then I will come in with Neocolors. I did start with the 40 colour set that I got as a gift. Now this has completely changed up because I swapped out a few colours that I didn't use much, and as you can see there's lots of holes because I now have this pot on my desk, which is what I reach for most. These ones have my favourite colours in and are most used. There are a couple in here that are replacements that I've bought when they're on sale, so when these are finished I'll go on to these. Just to show out how much I love these, I do also have a little pot which I recently sharpened with all the broken ones. I am very heavy-handed, I do get told that a lot on my channel, and so they do snap and break, which is why you'll see half sticks in my collection. So like I mentioned in the introduction, I will be sharing my top colours and my favourite colours in all my mediums in next week's video, but I love using these as my pops of colour. So again, you'll see in the videos where I'm adding this on. So I have created work before using just Neocolors, and I do sometimes work with only them. But that is quite rare. The most common way that I use these with my mixed media combinations is for final pops of colour. So that's why I love some of the brighter ones, the turquoises, the blues, the very vibrant greens. Sometimes I will use these as extra texture again, so as well as adding on my pops of colour to areas of the painting, I will sometimes use these for texture, so some of the greens especially I'll use on top of blocks of green for foliage, extra texture for leaves, and just to enhance the final painting. So that is definitely number one. That is my favourite mixed media combination. Doesn't really matter what the base layer is, but my go-tos are gouache and watercolour, paired with coloured pencils and then Neocolors on top. The Neocolors are wax based, so you can't then put the pencils on top of the Neocolor, which is why it's usually my final step. Okay, so on to my second mixed media combination. These next ones aren't in order, but I did want to start with that one first. But the next one is acrylic marker base and then Derwent Inktense. So I've been doing that quite a lot during my Norway month last month, but it's been a go-to ever since I fell in love with these acrylic markers. So I do have quite a few brands, but these ones are the ones that I've mixed myself. I have a whole video about that on my channel, so I'll leave that linked in the cards and down below in the description box again. But I found that the colours that you kind of buy off the shelf were way too bright for me, and I do have a sort of set colour palette for my paintings. So I mix these up myself. It's not a cheap thing to do by any means, but they do last really well, and these have lasted a really long time for me. So obviously greens are my go-to. I've also got these colours which I really enjoy using, but I've mixed these up with Montana and Molotow inks and then created my own mixes and put them either in empty Montana markers or some cheap ones that I've got from Amazon, which have been absolutely fine. I haven't had any leaks at all. So I put these down as my base layer, which you'll see here, and they work really, really well because I can get really thick marks. My favourite ones are the 16mm, so the chisel shaped nib, and these are really, really fat and really good at getting some juicy brush strokes. I much prefer these to the really thin acrylic markers, so you can get really thin ones like 2mm or 8mm. Usually the thicker ones don't come in as many colours, which is also another reason why I've decided to mix my own. So these are brilliant because they do dry matte, which means I can then come on top with Derwent Inktense. Because they are acrylic, they also dry fixed, so they don't reactivate like a traditional gouache would. So I love pairing this with Derwent Inktense. So I love using the Derwent Inktense blocks, and I also have the Derwent Inktense pencils. Now I do have bigger selections of these, but again, I prefer to have my most used colours nearby. But these are brilliant because they, again, really encourage my play and my looseness. I think Derwent Inktense is the one medium that I use the most for extra texture and also for play. They really do encourage me to just go a little bit wild with my marks, and I just love that you can dip them in water and then smudge them out. So I do get quite messy with these, but I think, using your fingers and smudging really enhances that joy for me. So I tend to scribble these on. I usually do dip them in water first, and then that creates that sort of inky effect, and then I'll apply them to the page on top of the acrylic marker base. I like the scribbles that you can get with these, and then they do dry matte, so they go down quite glossy and then they flatten a little bit in colour, but they are much more intense when they are wet than they are dry. Again, they do dry fixed as well, so they won't be able to be reactivated, so very versatile, and I just love combining these two. Definitely one of my favourites, just because it does allow me to take more risks and play a little bit more. I also really like using these out and about. The Inktense definitely get a little bit messy, but the acrylic markers are great for throwing into my pencil case and taking them on location. Okay, next up, number 3 is an acrylic gouache base and then traditional gouache on top. Sometimes it can be a little bit confusing if you are a beginner, the differences from traditional gouache and acrylic gouache. So traditional gouache is usually what I'll be using. That's these little ones that I shared on number 1. And these you can put on your palette and then reactivate them. So I will regularly put too much on my palette and then reuse what I've already put down, because they will get reactivated when you add water to them. Whereas acrylic gouache is much more like acrylic paint, and you can't do that. So once this is on your palette and it's dried, you won't be able to get any colour from it. It's completely fixed. So the way I love using these is to use them as my base layer. So I've done this quite a few times. There's a few examples, including these on screen, where I've used this as a flat colour base. Recently I've been experimenting with not just flat colour, I've been mixing these and purposefully creating lots of texture in my backgrounds for my prepped background pages, and then working on top of that. And I've absolutely loved that. It's really become a thing that I've found a lot of joy from this year, and then working on top with traditional gouache. I also work on top with other things, but I think the gouache works well because, again, it's in my comfort zone. So I can put this down as my base and then come back with number 1, where I do my gouache, coloured pencils and Neocolors on top of this. So you can kind of see how with mixed media it's all interlinked. You can try new things and see how they work and then add other things on top or beforehand. So that's definitely what I do here. I love using this as the base because the acrylic gouache dries matte. And that's really important. So I know some acrylic paint dries kind of glossy. So for me, this is perfect. I love the colours. I tend to always use the Holbein acrylic gouache. I got most of these from Japan, so they were nice and cheap, but you can get them on sale and they do sell them in sets here. Again, I'll share my favourite colours next week, but I really love these. It creates such a nice flat base, and then I can work on top knowing that it won't reactivate and muddy my colours. I tend to use my acrylic gouache in that way as base layers rather than using it to paint on top with, but that's just personal preference. Okay, so my next favourite is using fountain pen and watercolour. So this is a little bit different from the first one because this one focuses more on outlines. And I absolutely love this combination. I used it a lot when I started using watercolour, and it's really helped me to find my style with watercolour and ink work. So these are my favourite fountain pens, so a spoiler for next week, but I can't not mention them with this combination. So these are the Sailor Fude de Mannen pens. This green one is 55 degrees, so it's got a bent nib, which I'll do a close-up of on screen. And then the pink one is a 40-degree nib. As I said, I don't often use line work and outline, but when I do, I really do enjoy it. I did it quite a lot with my food month when I did that theme on Patreon earlier this year, and I think it pairs really nicely with watercolour. I tend to always use my watercolour with coloured pencils as well as my ink line. As I said in number 1, I do often use watercolour with my other mediums, but if I'm using these, it will always be with watercolour. I haven't ever used this with gouache or anything, so it's definitely one of my favourite combinations. I don't tend to colour in. I try to still keep my watercolour on top nice and loose. I don't like the idea of being too tight, so it's trying to find the balance of using this ink line with the watercolour, and the watercolour definitely means I'm a little bit looser, which I think is why I prefer this combination the most and haven't tried it with gouache. So definitely recommend. The ink that I use in here has to be water soluble because I tend to go on top. Sometimes I'll put the watercolour down and then the ink line first, but usually it's the other way around. So it needs to be water soluble so that it doesn't then bleed when I add my watercolour layer. Again, I will share this next week, but my favourite ink is the Atramentis Document Ink. That's my favourite ink that I've found so far. My green one is inked with black and the pink one is inked with sepia. So highly recommend this combination, especially if you do prefer more detailed work. I think this is a really good one to try. Okay, so lastly, my 5th favourite mixed media combination is brush pens and pan pastel. This is a combination I did quite a lot in my year-long daily art challenge. I've got my Tombow brush pens here in a pot, and a lot of people kind of dislike brush pens because they do have that squibbly texture. When you layer this on top of itself, it does create that effect, which a lot of people don't like. I tend to lean into that because I do like a lot of texture, so it's not really a problem for me, but combining it with pan pastel creates such a lovely effect. Now, this is something I absolutely love, and when I flick through my old sketchbooks, it's something that I really want to do more of. But I wanted to mention this because I don't generally see other people use pan pastel in this way. So I'll put down my base layer of brush pen, which you'll see on screen, and then I'll come in with my pan pastels. So I have quite a few of these. I have some greens, some blues, and this warm earthy palette. But what I love about pan pastel is that you can use it in a few different ways. One of my most popular videos here on my YouTube channel is 3 ways to use Tombow brush pens, and in that one I do use pan pastel on top to create depth. So you can layer this on top to add distance into your pieces as well, so it pushes things back, especially lighter colours. But I really love using my greens as well because it really softens the effect. It layers on top beautifully with the brush pens. I've done this outside too, so I've done this on location, so I'll include some snippets from that as well. but it really finishes things off nicely. It makes it feel very finished and it adds kind of a velvet effect to the final piece. I think green is probably my favourite combination for adding on top, again because I do draw a lot of landscape. So I'm not going to include this in my favourite supplies next week, but I think my most used is this 220.1 Hansa Yellow Extra Dark. So this is one of my favourite combinations and I wanted to mention it because I don't see it used often. It is a really unique texture and one that I have a lot of fun with. I tend to apply the pan pastel with either these tools, which are from Soft. I've also got this Sketch Plan version, which is a cheaper version. Both do the same thing. They come with these sponges on a stick, and I have one colour on one side and another on the other side, and I blend out the colour with that. If you use your fingers, it doesn't work as well, so I highly recommend these, or just using sponges like this. This was a very cheap set of makeup sponges. I just apply it on there, and that's really great for a large block of colour. So definitely a fun one to try, and I recommend it, especially if you use pan pastel and brush pens and haven't ever combined them before. Okay, so those are my favourite mixed media combinations. I hope that's given you some ideas. Mixed media can be a little bit overwhelming, so hopefully there's some ideas here if you've been unsure on how to combine some of your supplies. I really recommend just experimenting and playing and finding your joy with it all, but I hope this has been helpful with some pointers. Do let me know what your favourite mixed media combinations are below. I'd love to hear them in the comments. A huge thank you to my patrons for their support. Without them I wouldn't be able to make these free YouTube videos every week, and a big thank you for watching. I hope to see you next week where I'll be sharing my ultimate favourite art supplies from 2025. So see you then and have a lovely week ahead. See you later.